An evil cop named Officer Rick steals a luxury car from a black teenage girl named Sierra, convinced she's a thief. But just 3 minutes later, the tables turn, and he's desperately begging for mercy. Will he escape the consequences of his actions, or is he about to face a reckoning with his own prejudice? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Sierra Carter sat behind the wheel of her father's sleek black luxury car, her heart brimming with joy. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow on the tree-lined streets of the wealthy suburb she was driving through. She couldn't help but smile as she thought about the letter she had received just yesterday, her acceptance to her dream college. "I did it," she whispered to herself, her fingers tapping excitedly on the steering wheel. All that hard work finally paid off. At 18, Sierra was a bright young woman with a promising future ahead of her. Her dark curls bounced as she bobbed her head to the music playing softly on the radio. She felt like she was on top of the world, and nothing could bring her down. Sierra's mind wandered to her father, Commander Matthew Jackson. He had been so proud when she showed him the acceptance letter. His eyes had lit up, and he had hugged her tightly, whispering, "That's my girl." It was his idea to let her borrow his car to celebrate. As she cruised down the wide, clean streets, Sierra couldn't help but marvel at the beautiful houses that lined the road. Each one seemed bigger and fancier than the last. Manicured lawns stretched out in front of them, dotted with colorful flower beds and ornate fountains. One day, Sierra thought to herself, I'll have a house like this. I'll make Dad proud. The thought of her future filled her with excitement. She imagined walking across the college campus, making new friends, and learning new things. She pictured herself in a cap and gown, her family cheering as she received her diploma. The possibilities seemed endless. Sierra took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the car's leather interior. She felt grown up and important behind the wheel of such a fancy car. It was a far cry from the beat-up sedan she usually drove to school. As she turned onto a quiet street, Sierra's mind drifted to all the people who had supported her along the way. Her teachers who had pushed her to excel, her friends who had studied with her late into the night, and most of all, her father. Commander Jackson had always been her rock, encouraging her to reach for the stars. I'm so lucky, Sierra thought, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. She was so lost in her happy thoughts that she didn't notice the police car pulling up behind her, its lights flashing. Sierra was completely unaware that in just a few moments, her perfect day was about to take an unexpected turn. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. As Sierra cruised down the quiet suburban street, lost in her happy thoughts, she didn't notice the police cruiser that had pulled out behind her. Officer Rick, a middle-aged man with a stern face and cold eyes, watched the luxury car with growing suspicion. No way a kid like that owns a car like this, Rick muttered to himself, his lips pressed into a thin line. Without hesitation, he flipped on his lights and siren. Sierra's heart jumped at the sudden noise. She glanced in her rearview mirror, confusion clouding her features as she saw the police car. Carefully, she pulled over to the side of the road, her hands shaking slightly as she turned off the engine. Officer Rick approached the driver's side window, his hand resting on his belt. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with a greeting. Sierra's brow furrowed, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course, officer. May I ask what I did wrong?" Rick's eyes narrowed. "Just hand over the documents, miss." With a small nod, Sierra reached for her wallet and the glove compartment, retrieving the requested items. She handed them to Rick, who snatched them from her hand. "This car is registered to a Commander Jackson," Rick said, his tone accusatory. "Care to explain that?" Sierra took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Yes, sir. Commander Jackson is my father. He lent me the car to celebrate my college acceptance." Rick scoffed, clearly not believing her. "Right, and I'm the Easter Bunny. Step out of the vehicle, miss." Sierra's heart raced, but she kept her composure. "Officer, I'm telling you the truth. You can call my father to verify." "I said step out of the vehicle," Rick interrupted, his voice rising. "Now." Slowly, Sierra opened the door and got out, her legs feeling weak beneath her. She stood tall, though, facing Rick with as much dignity as she could muster. "Sir, please," she tried again, her voice trembling slightly. "There's been a misunderstanding. I haven't done anything wrong." But Rick wasn't listening. His face was set in stone, his prejudices blinding him to the truth of the situation. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," he ordered. Sierra felt tears pricking at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't believe this was happening. Just moments ago, she had been on top of the world, and now she was being treated like a criminal. As she placed her hands on the warm metal of her father's car, Sierra could feel the tension in the air thickening. She realized with a sinking heart that Officer Rick wasn't going to listen to her explanations. His mind was already made up. The perfect day she had been enjoying just minutes ago now felt like a distant memory. Sierra stood there, her heart pounding, wondering how things had gone so wrong so quickly. Officer Rick stomped back to his patrol car, Sierra's documents clutched tightly in his hand. He slammed the door shut and began furiously typing on his phone. His face twisted into a scowl as he read the registration details. "Matthew Jackson," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "Yeah, right." Rick's mind was already made up. In his eyes, there was no way this young black girl could be related to someone important enough to own such an expensive car. His prejudices blinded him to any other possibility. He climbed out of his cruiser and marched back to Sierra, who was still standing nervously by her father's car. Her heart sank as she saw the anger on Rick's face. "All right, miss," Rick barked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You want to explain to me why this car is registered to a Matthew Jackson?" Sierra took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "Like I said, officer, Matthew Jackson is my father. He's a police commander. If you just call him, he can—" "Enough with the lies," Rick interrupted, his face reddening. "Step out of the vehicle, now." Sierra's hands trembled as she slowly opened the car door. She could feel tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, determined to stay strong. "Sir, please," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm telling you the truth. I haven't done anything wrong." But Rick wasn't listening. His hand rested on his belt as he glared at Sierra. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," he ordered. Sierra complied, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. She couldn't believe this was happening. Just an hour ago, she had been on top of the world, and now she was being treated like a criminal. Rick's voice crackled over his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Rick. I'm gonna need backup at my location. I've got a possible stolen vehicle situation." As Sierra heard those words, a wave of fear washed over her. She closed her eyes, silently praying for this nightmare to end. She thought of her father, wishing he was here to protect her. "Officer, please," Sierra tried one last time, her voice shaking. "Just call my father. He can explain everything." Rick's face hardened. "I've had enough of your stories, young lady. You're in serious trouble now." As they waited for backup to arrive, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sierra stood there, her hands pressed against the warm metal of her father's car, wondering how her perfect day had gone so terribly wrong. Sierra's heart raced as Officer Rick roughly grabbed her arm, forcing her away from the car. She stumbled, trying to keep her balance as he pushed her towards the patrol vehicle. "Please, officer," Sierra begged, her voice trembling. "You're making a mistake. Just call my father." Rick's face remained hard, his eyes cold as he ignored her pleas. "Turn around," he barked, spinning Sierra to face the car. Sierra felt the cold metal of the handcuffs against her wrists. The click of the cuffs locking into place echoed in her ears, a sound that would haunt her for years to come. Tears welled up in her eyes as the reality of the situation hit her. "You have the right to remain silent," Rick began reciting mechanically, but Sierra could barely hear him over the pounding of her own heart. Passers-by slowed their cars, gawking at the scene unfolding before them. Sierra felt their eyes on her, judging, assuming. She wanted to scream, to tell them all that she was innocent, but the words caught in her throat. "Officer, please listen to me." Sierra tried once more, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father is Commander Jackson. If you just call him—" "Enough!" Rick snapped, cutting her off. I've had enough of your lies. You're only making this worse for yourself. Sierra fell silent, realizing with a sinking heart that her words meant nothing to this man. She felt small, powerless, and utterly humiliated. As if things couldn't get any worse, Rick turned his attention back to the luxury car. He pulled out his radio and spoke into it. "Dispatch, I'm going to need a tow truck at my location. We've got a vehicle to impound." Sierra's eyes widened in disbelief. "No, you can't," she cried out, her composure finally cracking. "That's my father's car. Please, don't take it." But Rick paid no attention to her distress. He began filling out paperwork, occasionally glancing at Sierra with a smug look of satisfaction. Sierra leaned against the patrol car, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She watched helplessly as a tow truck arrived, its lights flashing in the fading daylight. The driver hooked up her father's car, preparing to haul it away. As the luxury car was lifted onto the tow truck, Sierra felt as if a piece of her heart was being ripped away. That car represented so much: her father's pride, her own accomplishments, the bright future that now seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Sierra sat on the cold concrete sidewalk, her wrists aching from the tight handcuffs. Passers-by slowed their steps, some even stopping to stare at the young woman in distress. She felt their eyes on her, burning with curiosity and judgment. Shame washed over her as she tried to make herself smaller, wishing she could disappear. With trembling fingers, Sierra managed to fish her phone out of her pocket. She dialed her father's number, praying he would answer quickly. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before she heard his familiar voice. "Sierra, what's wrong, sweetheart?" Commander Jackson's concern was evident even through the phone. "Dad," Sierra choked out, her voice breaking. "I need your help. I've been arrested. They think I stole your car." There was a moment of stunned silence before Commander Jackson's voice came back, filled with urgency. "Where are you? I'm on my way right now." As Sierra gave her location, she could hear her father grabbing his keys and rushing out the door. The call ended, and Sierra felt a small flicker of hope in her chest. Her dad was coming. He would fix this. Meanwhile, Officer Rick stood a few feet away, his arms crossed as he watched the street for the tow truck. He wore a self-satisfied smirk, convinced he had caught a car thief red-handed. Every now and then he would glance at Sierra, shaking his head in disapproval. "Should have thought twice before trying to joyride in a stolen car, Missy," Rick called out, his voice dripping with condescension. Sierra bit her lip, fighting back the urge to argue. She knew it would do no good. Instead, she focused on taking deep breaths, trying to stay calm until her father arrived. Minutes ticked by slowly, feeling like hours to Sierra. The sound of squealing tires made her look up, hope blooming in her chest. As the tow truck arrived, Officer Rick roughly guided Sierra into the back of his patrol car. The young woman's heart sank as she watched her father's cherished vehicle being hooked up to be towed away. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined to stay strong. The ride to the police station was tense and silent. Sierra stared out the window, her mind racing with worry and frustration. She couldn't believe how quickly her perfect day had turned into a nightmare. At the station, Rick led Sierra inside, her hands still cuffed behind her back. The fluorescent lights seemed harsh and unforgiving as they walked through the bustling corridors. Sierra felt small and vulnerable, acutely aware of the stares from other officers and staff. Rick sat Sierra down in a hard plastic chair near his desk, not bothering to remove her handcuffs. She winced as the metal dug into her wrists, but stayed quiet, knowing her father would arrive soon. Just then, the station's doors burst open. Commander Matthew Jackson strode in, his face a mask of controlled fury. His eyes quickly found Sierra, and his expression softened for a moment before hardening again as he turned to face Officer Rick. His eyes quickly found Sierra, and his face twisted with a mix of anger and concern. He rushed to his daughter's side, kneeling beside her on the sidewalk. "Sierra, are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle as he examined her, checking for any signs of injury. "I'm okay, Dad," Sierra replied, her voice small, just scared and embarrassed. "Excuse me," Jackson said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. I'd like an explanation for why my daughter is in handcuffs. Rick barely glanced up from his paperwork. Sir, this doesn't concern you. I'm in the middle of processing a car thief. Sierra's eyes widened in disbelief at Rick's dismissive tone. She opened her mouth to speak, but a subtle shake of her father's head stopped her. Jackson took a deep breath, his jaw clenching. Officer, I'm Commander Matthew Jackson. That stolen car belongs to me, and the young woman you've arrested is my daughter. Rick's head snapped up, his face paling as he realized his mistake. He stammered, Key Commander Jackson? I didn't know. Clearly, Jackson said, his voice ice cold. Now, would you care to explain why you arrested my daughter without proper cause? As Rick fumbled for words, Jackson's gaze swept the room. Other officers had stopped what they were doing, watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and unease. The tension in the air was palpable. Jackson turned back to Rick, his eyes narrowing. I'm waiting for an explanation, officer. And while you're at it, perhaps you can tell me why my daughter is still in handcuffs. As Commander Jackson stood there, his stern gaze fixed on Officer Rick, the rumble of an approaching tow truck filled the air. The tension in the station seemed to thicken as the reality of the situation sank in. Sir, Rick began, his voice wavering slightly. I was just following protocol. The car that you're about to tow away? Jackson interrupted, his voice low and controlled. The car that I gave to my daughter as a gift for her hard work and college acceptance? Rick's face flushed red, a mix of embarrassment and defensiveness. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the station doors swung open again. Officer Minda Ramirez, Rick's partner, rushed in, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Her gaze landed on Commander Jackson, and she froze mid-step. Commander Jackson? She said, her voice filled with surprise and a hint of fear. What are you doing here, sir? Rick's head whipped around to look at his partner, confusion etched across his face. Sarah hurried over to him, leaning in close to whisper urgently in his ear. Rick, that's Commander Jackson, our new boss. He just transferred here last week. What's going on? The color drained from Rick's face as the gravity of his mistake hit him like a ton of bricks. His eyes darted between Sarah, Commander Jackson, and Sierra, who was still sitting handcuffed in the chair. Jackson raised an eyebrow, his gaze moving between the two officers. I see introductions aren't necessary, he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Now, would someone care to explain why my daughter is still in handcuffs? The other officers in the station had fallen silent, all eyes on the unfolding drama. Rick fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking slightly as he moved to unlock Sierra's handcuffs. I'm sorry, sir, Rick stammered, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. As the handcuffs fell away, Sierra rubbed her wrists, relief washing over her face. Jackson helped her to her feet, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. A misunderstanding? Jackson repeated, his voice dangerously calm. Is that what we're calling racial profiling these days, Officer Rick? Rick flinched at the accusation, his face a mix of shame and fear. Sarah stepped forward, her expression apologetic. Commander, I assure you this is a misunderstanding on our end, she said, trying to salvage the situation. We'll make sure the tow truck is called off immediately. Jackson nodded curtly, his attention still focused on Rick. I think it's time we had a serious discussion about proper police procedures and the consequences of making assumptions based on race, he said, his voice firm but measured. Officer Rick straightened his back, trying to regain some semblance of control. His voice wavered as he spoke. Commander, I was just following standard procedure. The car. Standard procedure? Commander Jackson cut him off, his voice low but sharp. Is it standard procedure to handcuff a young woman without proper cause? Rick's face flushed red. He cleared his throat, desperately grasping at straws. Sir, we had reason to believe the vehicle was stolen. The registration is under my name, Jackson interrupted again, his patience wearing thin. Did you even bother to listen when my daughter tried to explain that to you? Sierra, still seated and handcuffed, looked up at her father with a mix of relief and lingering fear in her eyes. The other officers in the station shifted uncomfortably, the tension in the air palpable. Commander Jackson's gaze never left Rick as he spoke, his voice calm but filled with authority. "Remove those handcuffs from my daughter, now." Rick hesitated for a moment, his pride battling with the reality of the situation. Then slowly he reached for his keys. His hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the handcuffs, the metal clanking loudly in the quiet station. As the cuffs fell away, Sierra rubbed her wrists, relief washing over her face. She stood up, moving closer to her father, who placed a protective hand on her shoulder. Rick took a step back, his earlier confidence completely deflated. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, at a loss for words. Officer Ramirez, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "Commander, I assure you this isn't how we typically operate. We'll make sure this incident is properly documented and addressed." Jackson nodded curtly at Ramirez before turning his attention back to Rick. "Officer, I think it's time we had a serious discussion about proper police procedures and the dangers of making assumptions based on race." Rick's face paled, the full weight of his mistake finally sinking in. But even then, a flicker of defiance crossed his features. He straightened his uniform, clinging to the last shreds of his authority. "Sir, I was just trying to do my job. If you'd allow me to explain—" "Explain?" Jackson's voice was quiet but filled with barely contained anger. "Explain why you felt it necessary to humiliate and handcuff an innocent young woman without even listening to her? Explain why you were so quick to assume she was a criminal based solely on her appearance?" Rick's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. The gravity of his actions was clear, but his pride still wouldn't let him fully admit his mistake. Sierra rubbed her wrists, the ghost of the handcuff still lingering on her skin. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she looked up at her father, seeking comfort in his familiar presence. Commander Jackson wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "It's okay, baby girl," he whispered, his voice soft and soothing. "You're safe now." Sierra leaned into her father's embrace, drawing strength from his steady presence. But even as she found solace in his arms, she couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation that clung to her like a second skin. The memory of being handcuffed in front of curious onlookers made her cheeks burn with shame. Jackson's eyes, usually warm and kind, now blazed with barely contained frustration. He glanced at Officer Rick, who stood rooted to the spot, his earlier arrogance replaced by a look of dawning horror. The officer's face had drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as he struggled to find words. "Officer Rick," Jackson's voice cut through the tense silence, calm but laced with steel. "I hope you understand the gravity of what's happened here today." Rick swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He shifted from foot to foot, looking everywhere but at the father and daughter before him. The weight of his actions seemed to press down on his shoulders, making him appear smaller with each passing moment. Jackson continued, his words measured and deliberate. "There will be consequences for your actions. This incident will not be swept under the rug or forgotten." Rick's eyes widened, the full impact of Jackson's words hitting him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The realization of just how much trouble he was in seemed to finally sink in, etching itself across his features. The other officers in the station watched the scene unfold, a mix of shock and discomfort evident on their faces. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, everyone acutely aware of the significance of this moment. Sierra, still nestled in her father's protective embrace, lifted her chin. Despite the lingering fear and humiliation, a spark of determination flickered in her eyes. She looked directly at Officer Rick, her voice quiet but steady as she spoke. "I hope you learn from this. No one should have to go through what I did today." Her words hung in the air, a powerful testament to her strength and resilience in the face of injustice. Jackson squeezed her shoulder gently, pride mingling with the anger in his eyes. Commander Jackson took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the group of officers gathered around him. The tension in the air was palpable, but Jackson's calm demeanor seemed to steady the atmosphere. He gently guided Sierra to a nearby bench, making sure she was comfortable before turning to address the officers. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice clear and authoritative, "I believe it's time we had a frank discussion about what happened here today." He paused, letting his words sink in. "As some of you may already know, I'm Commander Matthew Jackson, your new police chief." A ripple of surprise passed through the group. Officer Rick's face paled even further, the realization of just how badly he had misjudged the situation hitting him anew. Jackson continued, his tone measured and thoughtful. "I want to make something very clear from the outset. In this department, under my leadership, we will value fairness and justice above all else. What transpired here today falls far short of those ideals." He turned his gaze to Officer Rick, who seemed to shrink under the weight of his stare. But instead of the harsh rebuke Rick was clearly expecting, Jackson's voice softened. "Officer Rick, I won't deny that I'm deeply disappointed by your conduct today. However, I believe that moments like these can be opportunities for growth and change." Rick blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting this approach. Jackson continued, "I want you to take some time to reflect on your actions. Think about the assumptions you made, the biases that influenced your decisions. Consider how this incident has affected not just my daughter, but our community's trust in law enforcement." Jackson's words seemed to resonate with the other officers as well. Many of them shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing similar biases within themselves. "This isn't about punishment," Jackson said, his voice filled with conviction. "It's about learning, growing, and becoming better officers, better people. I believe in second chances, in the power of redemption. But that redemption must be earned through genuine reflection and a commitment to change." He looked around at the group, making eye contact with each officer. "I want all of you to use this incident as a catalyst for self-examination. We have a responsibility to protect and serve all members of our community, regardless of their race, age, or appearance. We must do better." Jackson's words hung in the air, powerful and inspiring. Even Sierra, still shaken from her ordeal, looked at her father with a mix of pride and admiration. The wisdom and leadership he displayed in this moment were truly remarkable. Sierra, who had been quietly sitting on the bench, her eyes fixed on the ground, slowly raised her head. Her voice was soft but steady as she began to speak, drawing everyone's attention. "I've always been taught to respect the police," she said, her words cutting through the tense silence. "I thought if I was polite and did everything right, I'd be okay. But today..." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "Today, I felt powerless. Like nothing I said mattered." The officers shifted uncomfortably, but Sierra continued, her voice gaining strength. "When those handcuffs went on, it wasn't just my wrists that hurt. It was my pride, my sense of who I am. In that moment, I wasn't Sierra Carter, the girl who just got into her dream college. I was just another stereotype." Tears welled up in Sierra's eyes, but she blinked them back, determined to finish. "I felt like I was being punished for something I couldn't change. The color of my skin. Do you know how that feels? To be judged before you even open your mouth?" Officer Rick's face had gone pale. His earlier arrogance completely vanished. He looked as if each of Sierra's words was a physical blow, forcing him to confront the real impact of his actions. "I've worked so hard to get where I am," Sierra continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I've dreamed of this day for so long, and in just a few minutes it all felt like it was being taken away. Not because of anything I did wrong, but because of how I look." The atmosphere around them had grown heavy, thick with emotion. Even the bystanders who had gathered to watch the scene unfold were silent, many wiping away tears. Sierra looked directly at Officer Rick, her gaze steady despite the pain in her eyes. "I want you to understand that your actions have consequences. They don't just end when the handcuffs come off. They stay with us, shaping how we see the world and our place in it." Rick's eyes were wide, filled with a mix of shame and dawning understanding. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. The weight of Sierra's words had rendered him speechless. Commander Jackson placed a gentle hand on Sierra's shoulder, his eyes shining with pride and sorrow. The other officers stood in stunned silence, the full impact of the situation finally sinking in. Commander Jackson turned to Officer Rick, his eyes filled with a mixture of disappointment and hope. "Officer Rick," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I need to know something. Are you willing to learn from this mistake, or do you intend to keep defending your actions?" Rick stood there, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Sierra's words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront the reality of what he'd done. For the first time in his career, he felt truly uncertain. I don't know what to say," Rick stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked at Sierra, then back at Commander Jackson, his eyes darting between them. "I was so sure I was doing my job, but now—" Rick's tough exterior began to crumble. His hands trembled slightly as he reached up to wipe the sweat from his brow. The internal conflict was clear on his face, a battle between his pride and the dawning realization of his wrongdoing. "I've always believed I was a good cop," Rick continued, his voice shaky. "But hearing Sierra speak, it's made me question everything. Maybe I've been wrong all along." Commander Jackson nodded slowly, encouraging Rick to continue. The other officers watched in silence, witnessing a transformation beginning to take place. Rick took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "I never thought about how my actions might affect someone like Sierra. I just I assumed—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sierra watched Rick intently, her earlier anger giving way to a cautious hope. She could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. "I think," Rick said slowly, "I think I need to learn. I don't want to be the kind of officer who causes this kind of pain." He looked at Sierra, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but I truly am sorry." The atmosphere around them shifted. The tension that had been building since Sierra's arrest began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of potential for change. As Officer Rick stepped away from the group, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his guilt. He found a quiet spot near his patrol car, leaning against it as he tried to process the events that had just unfolded. His mind raced with thoughts of his actions, the consequences, and the pain he had caused. Meanwhile, Commander Jackson turned his full attention to his daughter. Sierra stood there, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, still visibly shaken from the ordeal. Jackson's eyes softened as he looked at her, his heart aching for what she had endured. "Sierra, sweetheart," he said gently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" Sierra looked up at her father, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I don't know, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was so scared. I kept thinking about all those stories we hear on the news, and Jackson pulled her into a tight hug, his strong arms enveloping her protectively. "I know, baby girl, I know," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "But you're safe now. You did nothing wrong, you hear me? Nothing at all." As Sierra buried her face in her father's chest, the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. Jackson held her close, gently rubbing her back as she cried. The onlookers watched the touching scene, many of them feeling a lump form in their own throats. "You were so brave, Sierra," Jackson continued, his voice low and soothing. "You stayed calm and composed, even when things got tough. I'm so proud of you." Sierra pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I just kept thinking about what you always told me," she said, her voice steadier now. "To stay calm and use my words." Jackson smiled softly, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. "That's my girl," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You did exactly the right thing." As father and daughter shared this tender moment, the atmosphere around them seemed to shift. The earlier tension began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of quiet reflection. Bystanders who had gathered to watch the drama unfold now stood in respectful silence, many of them moved by the display of love and support between Jackson and Sierra. In this moment of calm, everyone present had a chance to breathe and process the emotional weight of the situation. The father-daughter bond between Jackson and Sierra served as a powerful reminder of the importance of family, love, and understanding in the face of adversity. The next morning, the sun rose over the city, casting a warm glow on the streets where yesterday's tense confrontation had taken place. Commander Jackson sat at his desk in the police station, sipping his coffee and reviewing the incident report from the previous day. He had just finished a meeting with the department's public relations team, discussing how to address the situation internally. Suddenly, there was a knock at his office door. "Come in," Jackson called out, setting down his mug. Officer Rick entered, looking visibly stressed. His usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that radiated from him. "Commander Jackson," he began, his voice tight, "I wanted to speak with you about yesterday's incident." Before Jackson could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing as he read the contents. "It seems we have a new development, Officer Rick," he said, looking up from his phone. "A passerby just informed me that a video of yesterday's incident has been recorded and is going viral on social media." Rick's face paled, his eyes widening in shock. "A video?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Jackson stood up, his expression serious but not unkind. "This changes things, Rick. The public will soon know about the arrest, and we need to be prepared for the fallout." As if on cue, Jackson's phone began to ring. The caller ID showed it was from the mayor's office. Jackson held up a hand to Rick, signaling him to wait, and answered the call. While Jackson spoke in hushed tones, Rick sank into a nearby chair, his mind racing. The realization of what this viral video could mean for his career and personal life hit him like a ton of bricks. He could already imagine the public outrage, the calls for his badge, the disgrace that would follow him and his family. Jackson ended the call and turned back to Rick, who looked up at him with a mixture of fear and desperation in his eyes. "Sir," Rick began, his voice shaky, What's going to happen now?" Commander Jackson took a deep breath, considering his words carefully. "The situation has become more complicated, Rick. The video is spreading fast and we're going to have to address this publicly. The mayor is calling for an immediate press conference." Rick's face crumpled, the full weight of his actions finally sinking in. "I never meant for this to happen," he said, his voice barely audible. "I thought I was doing my job, but now, everything's falling apart." Jackson watched the officer, seeing the internal struggle playing out on his face. The commander knew that the coming days would be challenging for everyone involved, but especially for Rick. Commander Jackson stood silently for a moment, his eyes fixed on the troubled officer before him. The weight of the decision he faced pressed heavily on his shoulders. He knew that his choice would not only affect Rick's future, but also the entire police department and the community they served. "Rick," Jackson said softly, breaking the tense silence, "I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. This video has the potential to change everything." Rick nodded, his eyes downcast. "I know, sir. I'm scared of what might happen." Jackson walked to the window, gazing out at the bustling city below. He could almost feel the tension building in the streets as news of the video spread. "We have two paths before us," he explained, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "We can let the video run its course, allow public pressure to force change in our department. Or we can try to get ahead of this, protect our officers from the harshest backlash." He turned back to face Rick, his expression grave. "Neither choice is easy, and both will have consequences we can't fully predict." Rick looked up, his face a mix of hope and fear. What are you thinking, sir?" Jackson sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. "If we let the video spread unchecked, it could lead to real, meaningful change in how we operate. The public outcry might force reforms we've been struggling to implement for years." He paused, considering the flip side. "But it could also destroy careers, including yours, Rick. The backlash could be brutal, not just for you, but for your family too." Rick winced at the thought but remained silent, waiting for Jackson to continue. "On the other hand," Jackson went on, "if we try to get ahead of this, control the narrative, we might be able to protect our officers from the worst of the public anger, We could use this as an opportunity to show that we're committed to change, without sacrificing individuals to public outrage. He walked back to his desk, his brow furrowed in concentration. But if we do that, we risk looking like we're covering something up. It could undermine public trust even further, make it harder to implement real change in the long run. The room fell silent as Jackson contemplated his options. He could feel Rick's anxious gaze on him, could almost hear the officer's racing heartbeat. Outside, the sounds of the city seemed to grow louder, as if the whole world was holding its breath waiting for his decision. Jackson's phone buzzed again, another message from the mayor's office demanding an immediate response. The pressure was mounting, and he knew he had to make a choice soon. But the consequences of either path loomed large in his mind, each with its own set of risks and potential rewards. Commander Jackson took a deep breath, his decision made. He turned to face the group of officers gathered in the room, their faces a mix of anxiety and anticipation. "Listen up, everyone," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're going to tackle this head-on. I won't let our department be torn apart by public outrage, but I also won't sweep our mistakes under the rug." The officers exchanged nervous glances, but Jackson continued, his resolve unwavering. "We're going to hold a press conference right now. We'll acknowledge what happened yesterday, but we'll also show that we're committed to learning and growing from this experience." Officer Rick looked up, surprise etched on his face. "Sir, are you sure? What about the video?" Jackson placed a reassuring hand on Rick's shoulder. "The video is out there, Rick. We can't change that, but we can control how we respond to it. This is our chance to show the community that we're not afraid to face our mistakes and work to be better." He turned to address the whole room. "This isn't about protecting ourselves. It's about protecting the trust between us and the people we serve. We need to show them that we're human, that we make mistakes, but that we're also committed to fixing those mistakes." The tension in the room began to ease as the officers saw the wisdom in Jackson's plan. Even Rick, who had been visibly shaken, seemed to stand a little taller. Jackson continued, his voice growing stronger. "I want all of you there. This isn't just about one incident or one officer. This is about all of us committing to do better, to be better." He paused, looking each officer in the eye. "We have a chance here to turn this into something positive, to show real leadership and integrity. Are you with me?" A chorus of "yes, sir" filled the room, the energy shifting from fear to determination. Jackson nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "All right then. Let's get ready. We've got a lot of work to do." As the officers filed out to prepare for the press conference, Jackson felt a mix of emotions. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was confident it was the right one. This was a chance to show not just his leadership, but the true character of his department. He thought of Sierra, still shaken but safe at home. He hoped that this decision would help heal not just the community's trust, but his daughter's faith in the system too. With a deep breath, he straightened his uniform and headed out to face the cameras, ready to lead by example. Commander Jackson stood at the podium, his face a picture of calm determination. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing and microphones pointed towards him. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment on his shoulders. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I'm here today to address a serious incident that occurred yesterday, involving one of our officers and my daughter, Sierra Carter." A hush fell over the room as the reporters leaned in, eager to hear more. What happened yesterday was not just a mistake. It was a clear example of racial profiling, and it's something we cannot and will not tolerate in our police department, Jackson continued, his words firm and unwavering. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "My daughter, a bright young woman with a promising future ahead of her, was handcuffed and nearly arrested for driving a car that belonged to her family. The only reason for suspicion was the color of her skin." The room was silent now, every eye fixed on Jackson as he spoke. "I won't sugarcoat this. What happened caused pain, to my daughter, to our family, and to our community. But I stand here today, not to dwell on that pain, but to focus on how we can use this situation to bring about real, lasting change." Jackson's voice grew stronger, filled with conviction. "This incident has shown us that we have work to do. We need to address the biases that exist within our department and within ourselves. We need to do better, and we will do better." He outlined a series of reforms, including mandatory bias training for all officers and the creation of a community oversight board. As he spoke, the tension in the room began to shift. The reporters, who had come expecting a defensive stance, found themselves captivated by Jackson's honesty and commitment to change. "I want to be clear," Jackson said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This isn't just about one incident or one officer. This is about creating a police force that truly serves and protects all members of our community, regardless of their race or background." As he concluded his speech, a palpable sense of hope filled the room. The reporters, usually quick with their questions, sat in thoughtful silence for a moment. Jackson's words had struck a chord, offering not just an apology but a path forward. As Commander Jackson's powerful words filled the room, Officer Rick stood quietly at the back, his eyes fixed on the man he had wronged just a day before. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He watched as Jackson spoke about forgiveness and change, his words cutting through Rick's defenses like a hot knife through butter. Rick's mind raced back to the moment he had pulled Sierra over. He remembered the arrogance in his voice, the dismissive way he had treated her. Now, as he listened to Jackson speak about his daughter's pain, Rick felt a wave of shame wash over him. "We need to do better, and we will do better," Jackson's voice echoed through the room. Those words hit Rick hard. He had expected to be publicly shamed, to lose his job, to face the anger of the community. Instead, here was Jackson, offering a chance at redemption. The enormity of this gesture wasn't lost on Rick. As Jackson continued to outline plans for reform, Rick felt something shift inside him. The wall of pride and prejudice he had built over the years began to crumble. He saw, for the first time, the real impact of his actions. Not just on Sierra, but on countless others he may have mistreated in the past. Tears welled up in Rick's eyes as he listened to Jackson's words about creating a police force that truly served all members of the community. He realized how far he had strayed from that ideal, how he had let his biases cloud his judgment and tarnish his badge. The emotional impact of Jackson's forgiveness hit Rick like a tidal wave. Here was a man who had every right to be angry, to demand Rick's punishment. Instead, he was speaking about learning and growth. Rick felt a mix of gratitude and unworthiness wash over him. As the press conference continued, Rick stood rooted to his spot, his mind reeling with the depth of his mistakes. He thought about all the times he had acted without thinking, judged without understanding. The weight of those actions pressed down on him, making his uniform feel heavy on his shoulders. As the press conference wound down, the room buzzed with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Commander Jackson stepped away from the podium, his shoulders straight but his eyes tired. He scanned the crowd until he spotted Officer Rick, still standing at the back looking lost and overwhelmed. Jackson made his way through the dispersing crowd, nodding at reporters and fellow officers. When he reached Rick, he placed a gentle hand on the officer's shoulder. "Let's talk," he said quietly. Rick followed Jackson to a small empty office nearby. The room felt too small for the weight of what had happened between them. Rick stood awkwardly, his eyes fixed on the floor. Jackson closed the door and turned to face Rick. "Officer," he began, his voice firm but kind, "I want you to understand something important." Rick looked up, his face a mix of shame and fear. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I know I messed up badly." Jackson nodded slowly. "You did. But that's not why we're here now." He took a deep breath. "True justice isn't about punishment, Rick. It's about change." Rick's brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't understand, sir. After what I did to your daughter?" "What you did was wrong," Jackson agreed. "But tearing you down won't fix anything. It won't help my daughter, and it certainly won't help our community." Tears welled up in Rick's eyes. "Then what happens now?" Jackson's face softened. "Now we work on making things better, not just for you, but for everyone." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm offering you a chance to be part of something important, Rick. Our department is starting a reform program focused on racial sensitivity and empathy. I want you to be part of it." Rick's eyes widened in surprise. You want me to participate? Even after everything?" "Especially after everything," Jackson said firmly. "Your experience, your journey, it could be valuable. It could help other officers understand and change." Rick felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Gratitude, relief, and a deep sense of responsibility all mixed together. I don't know what to say, sir. Thank you. I promise I won't let you down." Jackson nodded, a small smile on his face. "This is your second chance, Rick. Use it wisely. Learn, grow, and help others do the same." As the weight of this opportunity settled on him, Rick straightened his shoulders. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but he was ready to face it. "I will, sir," Rick said, his voice steady and determined. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." As the days passed, the police department buzzed with a new energy. The reform program, spearheaded by Commander Jackson, was in full swing. Officers filed into training rooms, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Officer Rick sat at the front of one such room, his notebook open and pen ready. He felt nervous, but there was also a spark of determination in his eyes. As the instructor began to speak about unconscious bias, Rick found himself hanging on every word. "We all have biases," the instructor explained, her voice gentle but firm. "The key is recognizing them and learning to challenge them." Rick glanced around the room, noticing the thoughtful expressions on his colleagues' faces. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He realized that he wasn't alone in his struggle to confront his own prejudices. As the days went by, the training sessions delved deeper. Role-playing exercises put officers in challenging situations, forcing them to confront their own knee-jerk reactions. Rick found himself sweating through a scenario where he had to de-escalate a tense situation without relying on force. "Remember," the instructor coached, "communication is your most powerful tool." Rick took a deep breath and tried again, this time focusing on listening and empathizing with the person in distress. To his surprise, the situation resolved peacefully. A small smile tugged at his lips as he realized he was learning, growing. Outside the training rooms, changes were visible throughout the department. Posters promoting diversity and inclusion appeared on walls. Officers could be overheard discussing what they'd learned over coffee in the break room. The mood was shifting, slowly but surely, from tension to hope. One afternoon, Rick found himself paired with Officer Maria Rodriguez for a community outreach event. As they prepared to leave the station, Rick felt a flutter of nervousness. "You ready for this?" Maria asked, a friendly smile on her face. Rick nodded, taking a deep breath. "I think so. It's different, but in a good way." As they walked through the neighborhood, greeting residents and answering questions, Rick felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He was connecting with people in a way he never had before, seeing them as individuals rather than potential threats. Back at the station, Commander Jackson watched the changes unfolding with a sense of cautious optimism. He saw officers like Rick taking their first steps toward becoming better public servants, and it filled him with hope for the future. As the reform program continued to transform the police department, Sierra Carter found herself at the center of a growing movement for change. The young woman who had once felt powerless now stood tall, ready to share her story with the world. On a warm afternoon, Sierra took the stage at a community event organized by local activists. The crowd fell silent as she approached the microphone, her father, Commander Jackson, watching proudly from the sidelines. Sierra took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she began to speak. "A few weeks ago, I was just a girl excited about college," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Then, in a matter of minutes, I found myself handcuffed on the sidewalk, treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of my skin." The audience listened intently, many nodding and understanding. Sierra's words painted a vivid picture of that fateful day, bringing tears to the eyes of some listeners. "I was scared," she continued, her voice cracking slightly. "I felt so small, so helpless. It was like my voice didn't matter, like I didn't matter. A hush fell over the crowd as they absorbed the weight of her words. Sierra paused, gathering her strength before continuing. But today I stand before you not as a victim, but as someone who believes in the power of change, she said, her voice growing stronger. What happened to me was wrong, but it's also an opportunity for us all to learn and grow. As Sierra spoke about her hopes for the future, her eyes shone with determination. She talked about the reform program her father had implemented and how it was already making a difference in the community. I believe in a future where no one has to feel the fear I felt that day, Sierra declared, her voice ringing out clear and strong. A future where we see each other as human beings first, where we listen and understand before we judge. The audience hung on her every word, moved by her resilience and grace in the face of injustice. As Sierra finished her speech, the crowd erupted in applause, many rising to their feet in a standing ovation. In that moment, Sierra realized that her voice, once silenced, now had the power to inspire change. She had become a symbol of hope, her story touching hearts and opening minds. As she stepped down from the stage, Sierra was embraced by her father. Commander Jackson's eyes glistened with pride as he held his daughter close. "You did good, sweetheart," he whispered. "You did real good." As the days passed, Officer Rick found himself grappling with the weight of his actions. The image of Sierra, handcuffed and humiliated, haunted his thoughts. He knew he needed to make amends, not just for Sierra's sake, but for his own growth as well. With Commander Jackson's guidance, Rick took the brave step of requesting a meeting with Sierra. His heart raced as he waited in the small conference room at the police station, nervously adjusting his uniform. When Sierra walked in, accompanied by her father, Rick felt a lump form in his throat. She looked poised and confident, a stark contrast to the frightened young woman he had encountered that fateful day. "Sierra," Rick began, his voice wavering slightly, "I can't thank you enough for agreeing to meet with me. I owe you an apology." Sierra nodded, her expression guarded but open. Rick took a deep breath and continued, "What I did to you was wrong. It was unfair, and it was cruel. I'm truly sorry for the pain and humiliation I caused you." As Rick spoke, his eyes filled with tears. That day, it opened my eyes. I've been forced to confront the prejudices I didn't even know I had. It's been a hard journey, but I'm learning. I'm trying to be better. Sierra listened intently, her expression softening as she saw the genuine remorse in Rick's eyes. "Your father," Rick said, glancing at Commander Jackson, "has been incredibly patient with me. He's been helping me understand where these biases come from and how to overcome them. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm committed to change." Commander Jackson placed a supportive hand on Rick's shoulder, nodding encouragingly. Rick turned back to Sierra, his voice filled with sincerity. "I know my words can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that your strength and grace have inspired me. You've taught me a valuable lesson, and I promise to carry it with me every day on the job." Sierra took a moment to process Rick's words. Then, with a small smile, she said, "Thank you, Officer Rick. Your apology means a lot to me. I'm glad something positive could come out of that terrible day." As the conversation continued, Rick shared more about his journey of self-reflection and the steps he was taking to address his biases. Sierra listened attentively, occasionally asking questions or sharing her own thoughts. By the end of the meeting, there was a palpable sense of healing in the room. While the incident would never be forgotten, it had become a catalyst for positive change, not just for Rick, but for the entire police department. As the warm summer evening settled over the community center, a crowd gathered for the annual Young Achievers ceremony. The air buzzed with excitement and pride as parents, teachers, and community members came together to celebrate the accomplishments of local students. Officer Rick stood near the back of the room, his hands fidgeting nervously with the small plaque he held. He scanned the crowd, his eyes eventually landing on Sierra, who sat beaming in the front row next to her father, Commander Jackson. The Master of Ceremonies stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special presentation tonight. Officer Rick Thompson would like to say a few words and present an award." A hush fell over the room as Rick made his way to the stage. He cleared his throat, his voice slightly shaky as he began to speak. "Good evening, everyone. I'm here tonight to honor someone who has taught me more than any textbook or training course ever could." Rick's eyes found Sierra's in the crowd. "Sierra Carter, would you please join me on stage?" Sierra, looking surprised, rose from her seat and walked gracefully to the stage. As she stood beside Rick, he turned to face her. "Sierra," Rick said, his voice thick with emotion, "your strength, dignity, and forgiveness in the face of injustice have been an inspiration to me and to our entire community." He paused, taking a deep breath. "This award is a small token of our gratitude for the grace you've shown and the positive change you've inspired." Rick handed Sierra the plaque, which read, "For outstanding character and courage in the face of adversity." As Sierra accepted the award, the audience erupted in applause, many wiping tears from their eyes. Sierra stepped up to the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "Thank you, Officer Rick. This means more to me than you know." She turned to face the audience. "What happened to me was painful, but it's led to real change in our community. I'm grateful for that and for the opportunity to be part of that change." As Sierra spoke, Rick stood beside her, nodding in agreement. The audience could see the mutual respect that had grown between them, a powerful symbol of healing and progress. When Sierra finished speaking, she turned to Rick and, in a spontaneous gesture, gave him a hug. The audience gasped softly, then broke into even louder applause. It was a moment of genuine reconciliation, touching the hearts of everyone present. As they left the stage together, Commander Jackson approached them, his eyes shining with pride. He shook Rick's hand warmly, then embraced his daughter. The ceremony continued, but the impact of that moment lingered in the air. It was a testament to the power of forgiveness, growth, and the potential for positive change, even in the face of adversity. As the Young Achievers ceremony came to a close, Sierra and Commander Jackson made their way through the crowd. Well-wishers stopped them at every turn, offering congratulations and words of support. Sierra clutched her award tightly, a symbol of her strength and the community's growing unity. They finally reached the parking lot, where the sleek luxury car gleamed under the streetlights. Commander Jackson pulled out the keys and handed them to Sierra with a smile. "You drive, sweetheart. You've more than earned it." Sierra's eyes lit up as she slid into the driver's seat. Her father settled in beside her, and she started the engine with a satisfying purr. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Sierra felt a sense of peace wash over her. The car that had once been at the center of such a painful experience now felt like a symbol of her resilience. As they drove through the familiar streets of their community, both Sierra and her father noticed subtle changes. On one corner, a group of police officers chatted amicably with local residents. Outside the community center, a colorful banner announced an upcoming diversity workshop. "Look at that," Commander Jackson said, pointing to a newly painted mural on the side of a building. The mural depicted people of all races joining hands, with the words, "Unity in Diversity," emblazoned across the top. Sierra smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Things really are changing, aren't they, Dad?" "They are, sweetheart," he replied, his voice filled with pride. "And you've been a big part of that change." As they turned onto their street, they saw neighbors out for evening walks, waving and smiling as the car passed by. The sense of community was palpable, a stark contrast to the tension that had existed just a few months ago. Sierra parked the car in their driveway and turned to her father. "You know, Dad, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm almost glad that incident happened. Look at all the good that's come from it." Commander Jackson reached over and squeezed her hand. "That's because you chose to respond with grace and forgiveness, Sierra. You've shown everyone the power of those qualities." They stepped out of the car, the cool evening air refreshing after the emotional ceremony. As they walked towards their front door, arm in arm, they both felt a deep sense of gratitude for each other and for their community's journey towards unity and understanding. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Rick, Commander Jackson, and Sierra, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.